Welcome to the final year of the 32nd year, our final program of the 32nd year of the World War II Roundtable. And something that I didn't see mentioned in the paper or the news, Happy VE Day. Sometimes these get passed over. As you know, this is our final program. It's kind of a sad night for me. This final program at this location, the Historical Society is going to be demolishing these facilities. I would like to ask, as you are able, those veterans that had some involvement in the D-Day landings, if they could stand up, please. I know we've got two of them down here. Are there any other D-Day veterans in the audience that participated in any event? Air, sea, land? Well, that is part of the reasons we do these programs, is to pay a great debt that we have as Americans to those that have fought to preserve it. Could I then ask for World War II veterans to stand up, regardless of Pacific? Jim.
Okay.
Thank you so much. And I wanted to express gratitude from the round table. We never quite cover our expenses for programs. So want to acknowledge the Legion Post in St. Louis Park. We just received a $2,000 check this evening from them. So. And Drew Kitt was the champion for us in doing that. Drew, thank you so much. I'd like to introduce the French consulate. Christina, could you come up? Christina Bouzuina, Sealander, is head of the Alliance Francaise here in the Twin Cities. They used to be downtown by the Federal Reserve. They're actually moving over west of the downtown to a new facility. She's done great leadership, and we try to liaison as best we can. So Christina, thank you for coming this evening.
Of course. Delighted to be here. Thank you, Don. Mesdames, Messieurs, Colonel Patton, dear veterans, bonsoir. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be with you this evening for a discussion on World War II and the upcoming 75th anniversary of the D-Day landings. To the French people, this military operation represents one of the most important pages of history of our country. Nearly 75 years ago, many young Americans, like yourselves, well, it was you, you put your ideals, your might, and your courage to the service and liberation of my country, to the service of democracy and the dignity of humankind. From June 6th, 1944, you fought bravely battles after battle across France and witnessed the worst of the war. Many did not return, but they are in our hearts, and fortunately, many did, to share their stories, like tonight. At the moving ceremonies organized for the 70th anniversary, in the presence of President Obama and French President François Hollande, they paid tribute to the veterans of the Second War. Twice last century, American soldiers restored freedom to France, and the French people will never forget what we owe America, our steadfast friend, partner, and ally. From Lafayette and Yorktown to the battlefields of World War I and the beaches of Normandy, our two countries have always stood shoulder to shoulder to defend and promote the values of freedom and democracy that are at the core of who we are. On that 6th of June of immortal memory, the tide turned, thanks to you. To quote the French president, the D-Day landings changed the course of our history, the history of humanity. Victory was still far off. There was much suffering to come, but hope was alive again at last. 75 years later, it's that same hope and that same ideal that we owe to those men, to you, and we shall never and we can never forget. To us, all of us, the French people, Americans, you are our heroes. On behalf of the French government and the French people, I'd like to thank you for your service to my country, to thank all our veterans. Your engagement is an example and an obligation for us, for future generations. There can be no future without memory. The torch you carried, so high and so far, the torch of freedom and dignity and respect for justice and democracy, still lights our way. Few of us in this room have lived in a country occupied by a foreign power. Few of us in this room have lived in a country where a war raged on its soil. The French men, women, and children who saw you arrive to liberate France have never forgotten. None of us will ever forget. 75 years later, it is our duty to keep this memory alive. Merci.
I'm not going to read this whole thing that Steve gave me. But he spent a lot of time in the Army. He spent a lot of time both in, he was actually in Desert Storm back when, comes out of Leavenworth. And any of you that have been here when we've had historians, speakers off the platform at Fort Leavenworth know what a treasure they are. And I will tell you, I've had such a great time with Steve over the last couple of days with knowing him personally and discussing all kinds of military strategy. Steve Bourque, if you would come up and tell us what happened in France. Thank you, sir.
I'm going to read a little bit, and then I'm going to just show some slides and talk. But I think I want to talk a little bit up front about, start out with one of thousands and thousands of examples. In the market and seminary town of Leaflets, the Courtier family was getting ready for bed on the evening of June 6th. Felix and Clements Courtier were getting their children ready for bed and preparing for the fighting they knew would soon take place. For the entire day, the sky was filled with Allied aircraft, dropping bombs and strafing the German troops, who were heading down the Route Départementale 613 over the small Tux River towards the battlefield near Caen. They had seen the Allied leaflets warning that the town might be bombed, but they had no transportation, and Clements was pregnant. And they decided not to risk moving out to the dangerous countryside. So they decided to prepare a makeshift shelter. Ground floor under the staircase. Is that thing still rubbing? What if I took this? It's the shirt collar. My God, and I'm not taking anything else off. I don't want to ruin the whole experience, you know? My God, it'd be terrible. So back to my story here. Find some place to hit that thing. They had seen the Allied leaflets warning that their town might be bombed, but they had no transportation, and Clements was pregnant, and they decided not to risk moving out to the dangerous countryside. So they prepared a makeshift shelter, ground floor level under the staircase in the center of the house. As the children, Paulette, 7, and Jean-Paul, 6, were putting on their pajamas, they heard the sound of the bombers approaching. So according to their rehearsed routine, the family headed into its makeshift shelter. Suddenly, the bombs began exploding outside. One destroyed their home's back wall, knocking young J.P., Jean-Paul, they called him J.P., unconscious. He recalled briefly waking up and calling out for water. He remembered his mother answering him. Then he again passed out, and remained unconscious for several hours. His neighbor, he found out later, had pulled him from the debris and had brought him across the street to an undamaged house. Seminary students who were searching for survivors found him and brought him to the local hospital. He remembered deliriously arguing with the nurses who were cutting his new socks off his... When he finally awoke, he was in the hospital along with his injured sister. Both of his parents were dead, the doctor had amputated his leg, and fire had burnt his house to the ground. Along with his parents, at least 700 Lexoviens, as they called themselves, were dead by morning, with many more wounded. Other than his sister, he was alone in the world with nothing left. And apparently, she died during the fighting later in August. One must wonder what J.P., who passed away in 1992, thought about his liberation experience. And I visited I took that picture. I visited that cemetery outside Le Sueur, and there's a whole series of plots there that say, very emotionally, to this family that was killed by the bombing on June 6th, 1944. So why did I write the book? Born in 1950, I was always somewhat perplexed as to why it appeared the French did not like Americans and were not grateful for their liberation. I assumed we were always the good guys, right? We're always the good guys. And we were fighting for liberty. One day at a French train station, I discovered another side of the story. Returning from a staff ride and eating breakfast in the Met station, I saw a large memorial plaque similar to this one, memorializing those rail workers killed by bombardment in the summer of 1944. I realized that was us. Walking to a nearby bookstore, I discovered Eddie Florentine's book, a journalistic account of the bombardment. I was frankly stunned, but it seemed somewhat true. Why was I not aware of the details? I've been studying this forever. Before I go on, I think it's important to note that this is not about victims' history or some do-good bashing of the U.S. military. I spent 30 years with the Army and in and out of uniform. As chief of night operations for the Big Red One on Desert Storm, I saw the power and capability of air power firsthand. As a historian teaching Army planners at the School of Advanced Military Studies, I have a pretty good understanding of combined arms operations and operational art. It is from that perspective I wrote the book. We want to get it right. And I also want to point out one more thing for all the Air Force folks in here. The Strategic Air Forces did not want to bomb France. No one in the Strategic Air Forces wanted to bomb France. I blame completely, 100% for anything here on the U.S. Army and the British Army, Montgomery and Eisenhower. All right, I'm going to back off from the reading for a bit and just kind of roll through, because we can do that and come back and talk about anything you guys are interested in. This is a typical narrative, D-Day, right? Okay, Band of Brothers, Patton coming. In fact, there are a number of people who think George Patton won World War II all by himself is phenomenal. He doesn't land on D-Day, but somehow he wins the fight. He breaks out all by himself. No one else is there. He gets on up to the Bulge, and for some strange reason, he ends up having to bail the 101st, the Band of Brothers, out of freaking Bastogne. Don't ask me how this all works together in someone's mind, but this is sort of the narrative. And then you've got, of course, The Longest Day, Privates Ryan, go on. And of course, really the narrative takes on a new life in 1984 when the Reagans show up at the cemetery, and that's some of the greatest speech writing you'll ever get anywhere, anytime. And he's standing at Pointe du Hoc, and he's standing there at the monument looking out at a crowd of veterans, and it describes the story of coming up those cliffs. And if you haven't been there, it's well worth the trip. And he's talking about, he points to these gentlemen and go, here are the boys of Pointe du Hoc. There was not a dry eye in the place that day. But that is the standard American D-Day narrative. Well, the air power guys have a narrative. I was listening to some of it today with our veterans. The war is taken to Germany. We bomb Schweinfurt, we bomb Regensburg. We go after the harbors, the subpens. There's not a lot of talk about bombing France. That's kind of on the side a little bit. So our veteran, the 100th Bomb Group, for example, on June 4th through 7th, they bombed in a series of days between June 4th and June 7th. The 100th Bomb Group went through Boulogne, Paris, Boulogne, Abbeville and Boulogne, Ouistreham, Falaise, Nantes, Tours, Berck, and Dunkirk. And that's all in the space of about 4 days. So it gives you an idea of this. In fact, just so I go on, until September 1944, more bombing missions are conducted against occupied Europe than against Germany. The other thing I want to, another caveat, is I'm not even going to talk about the bombing in Belgium. Oh my. That's a whole other book, or the bombing in targets in the Netherlands. So, we can come back to any of this we want to talk about later on. There are a whole lot of other D-Day narratives. Imagine being Polish. I'm sure there's some of you in here. Poles fought in two different armies. There are pictures up there of Poles in the bottom left who were fighting for the British, and on the far right, those are Poles fighting for the Russians. Their narrative of the war is not the same as ours. Or up in the right-hand corner, we see German soldiers. Who do they look like? They're Mongolians. They're Russians who are now fighting for the Germans. And so the different narrative, Canadians, by the way, do not ever get confused the Canadians with the British. That's not a good day when you do that. I got run out of freaking Windsor, Canada one day on that. France has its own narrative. And again, we have a tendency to think that the narratives are all the same. As I was telling Madame Consuelaire a little while ago, France has a very, very complicated history. France in the 1940s was in a civil war. They're fighting. We talk in the United States about a civil war, North and South, brother again. No, France really is in a civil war. They have a history of revolution, a brilliant history of revolution, and they're always fighting among themselves. And it was taking place. And in fact, if we talk sometime, if you're interested, the beauty of Charles de Gaulle, which Americans always have all kinds of strange reactions to, the beauty of he did not allow France to fall into a continued civil war after 1945. As much as he was a pain in the arse for Americans, he did what he had to do and kept France generally peaceful. And it's remained generally peaceful with very few kind of notable events. And again, depending where you are in France, you're going to have people who are in the resistance. You have people who are on the other side, the milice, fighting against the resistance. People supporting Vichy in the beginning of the war. Lots of people support Vichy and Marshal Pétain, the hero of World War I. By 1942, 43, people are going, I don't know where this war's going. And by 1944, of course, the war is changing, and now people go, oh. French industrialists, we'll talk that. French industrialists are making a lot of money early in the war off Germans. You know, many of the trucks that are sold that are used against the Wehrmacht, and tanks and artillery pieces are made by French in French factories. In 1940, French factories just don't disappear. They were the number one or number two producer of armaments by 1940. Where did those weapons go? Well, of course, they went to support the Wehrmacht. And French industrialists, there's a great French work done on it by French authors right now, historians. The French industrialists like Renault were very happy to watch that happen. So the French view of the war, the French view of the invasion, the French perspective on D-Day is much different than ours. So the areas that are circled up there are some of the areas that were the most heavily bombed. This thing has a pointer, if I point at this puppy, huh? All right, so up here, the whole Pas-de-Calais and the Nord area. That is, first of all, that is where most of the Germans expect the landings to take place up there. So when I talk about Fortitude, that's where that is. That's also this, do we hit the right button here? Technology. This area right here is where the V1 and V2 rockets are. Job one for Winston Churchill is don't let the place get hit by V1 and V2 rockets. Okay? This area right here is the invasion zone, of course, and the breakout area. And then you have along the Seine River, the bridges, and I'll point some of these later, and more bridges. Of course, for the British point, the other thing, if it's not job one, is job two, are the ports, and don't let the doggone submarines come out. Again, another great trip if you get the chance to go to Europe. Visit the submarine ports pens down along here. Oh my. Those things are just unbelievably, unbelievably huge. Why bomb France? A good question. Why should we bomb France? All right, for all you military history buffs, who's this guy? Rommel. Bernard Montgomery, the commander of 21st Army Group and the ground force commander, goes to bed every night with a picture of Rommel above his bunk. Rommel representing the German army and the German counterattack forces, just scared the bejesus out of them. Because in Kasserine Pass, Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, the Germans almost drive the Americans and the Brits into the sea. What happens when you go to France, where reinforcements are close, and you also have, where reinforcements are close, and they have a superb rail network and road network? You're going to have a problem. So Rommel becomes, the other thing I should point out is that there's a little bit, personalities enter. If you study this stuff, personalities are everywhere. And Eisenhower and Spaatz, Dewey Spaatz, the commander of Strategic Air Forces, they love each other, but they're in a serious fight. Who controls the air forces? And after Italy, Eisenhower, with George C. Marshall's support, is going to become and own the Strategic Air Forces. That include Bomber Command, the Royal Air Force's Bomber Command under Field Marshal Harris. Eisenhower in March threatens to resign if he doesn't get control of the Air Forces. He's ready to walk out the door. He has written his resignation letter in March, and he doesn't have to pull it because he gets control. So Eisenhower is going to use the bombers, another reason to bomb France, he's going to use the bombers as long-range artillery. Okay? This, by the way, makes the Air Force really, really angry, and they don't like it because they want to be strategic, go deep, only fight the Germans. All right. And again, we can come back. The other thing we ought to talk about is bombing occupied states. And if you guys have spent any time studying this theory, military theory stuff, you know there's a whole bunch of guys, DeWay, Trenchard, Billy Mitchell, right? Everybody knows Billy Mitchell. The idea is take the war to the enemy, go deep, take the war to the enemy. Bomb the bejesus out of it, the bombers will get through. Victory. It's a minor problem with all that. There's no, just as we roll on through, there's no theory. And how do you do that? So if we just bomb, what will it result in? What do we have to bomb? There's no theory about bombing occupied states. Neither DeWay, nor Mitchell, nor Trenchard write anything about bombing occupied states. There's no doctrine. So for those of us who spent time in the military, no doctrine is the how-to. We think if we put water on the ground, plants will grow, right? So how do we put water on the ground? Well, that's kind of simplistically what we're talking about. How do we bomb? How do we do it? There's no doctrine. In fact, and it confirmed this afternoon, listening to our veterans talk about the bombardments, they used the same formations bombing occupied states that they used bombing targets in Germany. And it's kind of the lawnmower approach. You've got a daffodil growing in your yard. The right answer is get a little Roundup, right? The other approach you can take, which is our approach, is get a big lawnmower. Got it? And you roll the lawn. Yeah, well, that's what we do. There's no concern. I have seen no analysis on bombing. How can we protect patrimony in the French word? How do we protect the historic background of our region? We're talking about, there's some beautiful churches in this town. Imagine the churches in this city. Imagine the churches that are in France, in places like Bayeux and Caen and Rouen. I mean, these are ancient. Caen is the home of William the Conqueror, good God. You know, these are old things. Where's the analysis done? As a planner, there's no analysis. And the civilian casualties, as a general rule, with a couple minor exceptions, are not particularly considered. The guy who worries about it, two groups. One is Winston Churchill, because he has to live next to the French. The war is going to end. The other one he has to worry about, the other people who don't want casualties are the Air Force commanders. And I said again, they are very sensitive. There are moments when Spaatz and Harris and Doolittle are literally in shouting matches with Eisenhower and his staff members about supporting Operation Overlord. Fascinating stuff to read. And again, these guys have no idea what they're doing in terms of targeting, navigation, any kind of precision. Now, keep in mind, and this is the caveat you got to keep in mind, these are kids. These are kids. We have 21, 22-year-old kids flying these airplanes with very little training, as we talked about ahead of time, very little training how to do it, and no specialized training. A target's a target's a target. Okay, no specialized training on how to hit targets in occupied states. The guys who are planning the missions, remember, there's no doctrine on how to plan them. They're learning they're learning targeting as they go. There's no way, they're learning it. What should we hit? Should we hit factories? Should we hit rail yards? Should we hit this? Should we hit that? And they're only 28 to 32 years old. So think about how young, these are like your college kids are now going to war with a whole lot of stuff, and they're learning as they're going. How old are your kids when they start having auto accidents and doing dumb stuff? Well, these are the guys that are flying. Yeah, so bad things are going to happen. And the other thing to keep in mind, and it's interesting to read, and again, the story of the heroism of pilots in the American, British, Canadian Air Forces flying into Germany is well known. But it's amazing to read the logs of the air crews, and realize they mention these great expanded descriptions of going to fly into Regensburg. But then the next day they're flying a mission to, I don't know, Nantes. And they barely mention it. Because there's no, again, as confirmed today, the Luftwaffe is not worried about that. After Big Week in February 44, the Luftwaffe is worried about protecting the homeland. So if you happen to bomb French targets, that's just the way it's going to be. Anti-aircraft fire, absolutely correct. They still got the AAA out there, the 88s and everything else out there, so it's going to be anti-aircraft. But so generally, most flights that go to France come home in pretty good shape. It's kind of a milk run, what normally called. So these are, the book has a whole lot of different chapters about different things, but these are the things we talk about in terms of supporting Operation Neptune. Neptune is the landing component of Operation Overlord. They changed the name because everybody's using Overlord, Overlord, Overlord. One, they're worried about compromise. Two, it's not specific enough about what they should be doing. So the name, when you say Operation Neptune, we're really focusing on the landing process. These are the things, the events that are directly related to Operation Neptune. Let's see. So it's hard to see, again, trying to do this on a computer and do that with maps. You see all these little rail centers. This, by the way, is a lot of them in Belgium, but as you note. Oh, wait, here's this thing again. Belgium, as you note, and then rail centers over here. What happens, of course, supplies need to come in this way, right? And the concern is the German army moving troops from the middle of Germany or Italy or the Russian front, sending them in there to drive the Allies back to the sea. So you got to stop the rail. So that's going to be the big thing. So these rail centers are identified and for targeting. I want to talk just about one of them right here, I think. This little, right over, where did I see Rouen? Is that Rouen right there? Let me see if I can see. Where am I? It's hard to see anything right there. Rouen-Sotteville. Here we are, Rouen-Sotteville, right here. This is the first bombing mission of the war, by the way. We could talk about that at some point. But Rouen, the first target's hit at the beginning of the war. It's hit a number of times. On April 19th, Eisenhower, Churchill had been fighting the bombing, picking up speed, and finally on April 19th, 1944, everybody stands up and says, do it. Well, Bomber Harris from the Royal Air Force says, we warned you what we're going to do. And on April 19th, he hit a number of cities across France. One of them is Rouen-Sotteville. By the time they were done with Rouen-Sotteville, I want you to see this. So there's the rail yard right here, and you can't see this real close, but my good friend Paul de Trivier, he has gone ahead and the citizens, by the way, the French know where every bomb lands. They literally know where every bomb lands. The prefects in the city and the civil defense people, they go out and they know where every single bomb lands. So there's where the target is right here. That's where the bombs go. Now, in France and in most of Europe in 1930s, 20s, 30s, and 40s, where did the railway workers live? Right next to the rail yard. There's no commuting in 1930s France. They live next to the rail yard in wooden homes. So when the bombs hit, they're in trouble. Yes, you knock out. So the reports are all the target. They hit the target. Got it, check mark. They hit some of the target. But look at the ones they don't. Just for the numbers, 900 dead that day. 900 dead in that one attack. So for every, let me do numbers for calculations for you all. France is 10% population-wise of the size of the United States. About 32 million, we got about 300 million, right? About 10%. So when I'm talking about 900 dead, that's 9,000 dead in our numbers, right? And for every dead civilian, there's probably going to be 2 to 3 wounded, not to mention the numbers of buildings, et cetera, destroyed. As one survivor said of all this, you bring us liberation with wooden crosses. So that's just one piece. Good God, this thing, where'd you get this thing? Good God. Anyway, time to tear the building down, I think. Let's tear this sucker down and get a new PA set. Sorry. My inner voice is coming out. But if you go visit Rouen, this is a scene from my friend, go back for a minute. My librarian friend, David Bellet, from the library in Sotteville, marvelous guy and a great medieval reenactor, by the way, which is fascinating. But in the town of Le Mans, right in Rouen, right near the, it's called the Place de April 19th. There's a very moving statue. If you can see, you've got the father looking up at the sky, the child looking up at the sky, and the mother holding the baby. Very moving statue of that situation. That's the event. So let me move on to number 2. Things get moved around in my book. That's okay. Number 2 are the bridges. Now, the bridges are a good topic, okay? Because there again, you see across France, in fact, of all the things you need to bomb, the bridges are a good idea because they really will stop the movement. As you go across there, you see all these little bridges. These are pretty much the job of the 9th Air Force. The 9th Air Force hits all of these. And in general, they get pretty good at them, but there's a problem with the 9th Air Force hitting these. First of all, the fighters are all working for the 8th. I'm not doing anything. The fighters are all moving for the 8th, fighting for the 8th Air Force. What the? Yeah, give me that thing. Yeah, it's driving me nuts. Okay, everybody hear me? Hey, good God. Okay, so up in the north, this is all the 8th Air Force business, okay? 9th Air Force, rather. And down below, just a day or two after, but just before D-Day, these are the bridges on the Loire River, and these are the targets of the 8th Air Force. I'll just drive on and keep moving, okay? So the issue with the 9th Air Force, which is kind of fascinating, while the bombers that are flying in, the medium bombers are doing their thing, the problem with the dive bombers, which should be the most accurate of all, these guys are flying for the 8th Air Force going air to air. Now look, I'm not a pilot, but I've been told by everybody, including to the guy that wrote Overlord, which is the best book on the topic, it takes a lot of training to convert from air-to-air combat to air-to-ground combat dive bombing. You just don't do that, say, okay, Vern, we're going to go do that right now. No, it's like parallel parking. It's not going to happen fast. So what happens is even if the first couple of aircraft get in there, right, and hit the target, the problem is now you get, by the time the second wave comes in, you've got anti-aircraft fire coming up around you, and you've got smoke everywhere. So invariably, even if the first bridge is hit, behind it all the town goes up. And again, in Normandy, the standard building material is wood. Doesn't last long. Rouen, just an example. So Rouen is a very interesting example of this marvelous city. And what happens in Rouen is the week before D-Day, they decide to go after they decide to take out the bridges. There were 3 bridges. By the way, before the Normandy Bridge, the Pont de Normandy, before that is built, this is the last series of bridges before you get out to the English Channel. So if you're bringing reinforcements from the north-south, this is one of the critical nodes in the whole thing. You got to take these bridges out. But for a week, God, what happened to my chart? That's not right. Anyway, let me go back for a minute. Okay. Well, just for a week, I think we'll work through this. You can see May 28th, 51 Thunderbolts, another 26 later in the evening. The May 30th, the next day, B-26s come rolling on in.
May 31st. Let's see what happened. Wait, there's a whole list. It goes on for a week. For one solid week, those fighter bombers and medium bombers come on in and take out the city. And the question is, what's that do? Well, we're not quite sure the numbers, but it's somewhere between 400 and 500 civilians are taken out in that particular week. So when you talk about celebrating D-Day, the French in Rouen call it La Semaine Rouge, Red Week. And this is what D-Day looked to them before they even start. Operation Fortitude. Okay, only briefly. Okay, military history guys, who's that? Patton, right? And everybody knows the story. Patton in Uxbridge, his speech talking about how the people of England and the United States are going to take over the world. It doesn't go well with Marshall and Eisenhower. In fact, and Roosevelt. If you ever want to read some really good stuff, read the correspondence between Dwight Eisenhower and George C. Marshall about Patton during this Operation Fortitude. Do you want to fire him? No, it's your job. I'm not going to fire him. You got to decide. He's a great commander, but he's a jerk. I know, but it's your decision. Eisenhower tries to get Marshall to fire him. Marshall tries to get, Eisenhower to fire. If you know the story, he doesn't get fired. He hangs around for a while. Don't talk, George. You've seen the pictures. Dummy tanks, dummy equipment, dummy everything, moving stuff up and down, fake signals, all not to make the Germans think that the Americans are coming up in the Pas-de-Calais, up in the British in the Pas-de-Calais. One other thing that makes sure that the Germans know we're coming that direction is for every single bomb dropped south of the Seine River, 2 are dropped in the north. This area right here. So every time they drop a bomb anywhere down here, they drop 2 up along here where the German defenses are. Since they're not really landing there, what's the measure of success? How do you measure success, all you management types? How do you measure success for a bombing mission up there in the Pas-de-Calais? Make noise. Make them think you're coming. If you hit the target, fine. If not, fine. The problem, of course, is where the bomb's going. They're going into French farms, French villages, and the casualties, which I talk about in the book, which we can talk about later, are pretty high. Pretty high. So that's another piece of the story that somehow gets lost in the frivolity of the bombings. Again, the Fortitude targets, this the area right here, just an up-to-date of what it looks like. And again, the other thing about northern France, so you know what the weather's been like this week, right? Is to say northern France in June, May and June, you can't. They're bombing. They call them. They call it overcast bombing technique, the overcast bombing technique, which essentially says, I think we're over ground, just throw the damn bombs out and come home. Yeah. And so, again, the problem is you don't hit anything. I mean, you do, okay, but you're usually hitting friendlies instead of the thing. Well, I really want to spend some time for the next couple of minutes is on this topic, because this is D-Day, right? This is about the landings. The problem is trying to drink water with me. So for the last 75 years, historians and others have been criticizing the bombing of targets on Omaha Beach. Most of you who do any history of World War II know that bombing target, as one infantry officer says, the Air Corps might just as well have stayed home in bed for all the good that their bombing concentration did. And keep that in mind, because this is, without question, the largest bombing mission, maybe in history, but certainly of the war. On June 6, 1944, there were 14,000 sorties in the sky. 14,000, with about 2/3 of that fighter aircraft and bombers. 14,000. You would think, given the penchant and tendency of the Air Force to celebrate their performance, that they'd be doing, high fives, jumping up and down, making all kinds of great noise. Not so much. The Joint Fire Plan, again, with the Joint Fire Plan, not the best chart, but we do what we can here. And you can see these little, this is the Normandy Beach. Okay, there's Utah Beach over here, and here we have the Omaha here, the British beaches here. All around here, you get batteries, artillery batteries that can affect the bombing. So The first job is going to be in the joint fire plan. The first thing is going to be to neutralize the big bunkers. You ever see the Longest Day, Longeau-sur-Mer, or Kreisbeck Battery, some of those? First job is to go in, and the British are going to go in and do that. Behind them are going to be the 8th and 9th Air Forces. Behind that's going to be warships, and then behind that, the troops land. That's the way it's supposed to do. The joint fire plan does not say anything about scare the enemy. Omar Bradley and Bernard Montgomery want targets destroyed, neutralized, banged up. This is not about, this is a serious business because they have calculated that if those bunkers aren't taken out, or at least neutralized, that we're going to take a lot of casualties. So, flash lamp. The first mission, the biggest bomber mission of the war for the British from the beginning until up to this point. 1,130 heavy bombers, Lancasters and Halifaxes. They go on in. Again, I'm not going to belabor the point, but they don't hit a lot of targets. They get close. They make a lot of noise. They wake the Germans up, who are soundly sleeping in their beds on a cold and nasty night. But they almost kill a number of their own soldiers, by the way, who are on the ground, which is at Pegasus Bridge and Mireville Battery, which is kind of annoying. So first thing is the flash lamp goes in. Get an idea of some of the targets. Again, this doesn't show up as well as it should, but those red targets are the ones they go into on D-Day. Behind them, we have the 8th Air Force. So you start talking about numbers. A little after 650 to 400, the 450 B-24s from Major General Hodges' 2nd Bomb Division arrived on Omaha Beach. Unlike the general accounts of the bombing, the 8th Air Force operation order spelled out names of the Pacific towns and Pacific places they wanted hit. I want you to think for a minute. If you've been to Normandy, you'll sometimes drive along the road and you'll see these very little positions, like a gun tooth. They'll put 12 B-17s or Liberators on that one little gun position. Now, remember how they're flying. Remember the Dandelion? Okay, and so that's going to be a problem. Now, what makes all this bombing by the 8th Air Force more problematic? Up until June 4th, Doolittle thinks he can do it. They got very primitive radar, H2X radar. They think it's very primitive. Is that going to come up next? Usually I like to have see if it comes up next. Yeah, this thing. What they like to do is you can see this very primitive radar here. That's the radar screen right here, very primitive. Doolittle, and it's a navigation radar, so you can see where the terrain is. That's all it is. It's not a targeting radar, it's a navigation. But you can pick out concentrations kind of thing. So that kind of a weather map thing. Where's the storm heaviest, you know? So Doolittle has got it figured out. So as late as June 3rd, the night of June 3rd, they go to bed. Doolittle says, I can take out the targets as you want me to, General Eisenhower. I can take those targets out. Don't worry about it. Just don't let the concern, of course, is fratricide. They want killing Americans because the Air Force knows they're not very accurate. They know at this point they're not very accurate. So they come rolling on in. As they come rolling on in, well, somebody, what they're supposed to do is see the end of the target and then at a certain point pull the lever, drop the bombs. Somebody, we don't know who, somebody makes the decision on June 4th to delay the bombing of the 8th Air Force targets from between 5 and 30 seconds, which means when they get to the point where they're supposed to drop, they say delay, and let's say it's 15 seconds, where's that next bomb going to drop? A ways away, a couple of miles away anyway. And what that means is they miss the freaking targets across the board. Now, the interesting piece, and let me do a little historiography here, what historians do, is at the bottom of the article of the chapter in the official history, it says Eisenhower approved this decision. No, he did not. The official history of the United States Air Force is frankly lying at that particular page. Did not happen. Dwight David Eisenhower, whatever you think about it, we can talk about Eisenhower, he did not make decisions in private. He did not make hasty decisions. Any decision he made was done in a group with the Army guys and the Air Force guys all in the same room. They sorted it out, and it was an agreed-on course of action. That's none of the official correspondence. And I've looked at correspondence literally in here in Great Britain. There's nothing. My good friend at the National Archives says that what he thinks happened is someone sent a note up the chain saying we're going to make this change in the plan, and nobody got the message and nobody replied. So they said, I guess it's okay. I guess he approved it. No, he didn't approve it. Sort of like your kid saying, I'm taking the car, and if you don't call me quick, I'm leaving. No, it's not what happens. So it's kind of interesting. I actually was just up in Chicago looking at the Cate papers. James Cate was one of the editors of the official history, and there's nothing. I can't find anything at all about this thing. So the H2X delay is a real mystery of the whole thing. And, of course, what that means, that is the explanation why none of the aircraft actually hit those targets. They just turned the heat on in here, too, didn't they? Man. The 9th Air Force, in contrast, the 9th Air Force hits their targets. Exactly. 9th Air Force performance on D-Day is nothing short of brilliant. Coming in low, coming in very low, coming in right on the targets. They hit every single target they're supposed to. And by the way, what that means is the 4th Infantry Division storming ashore on Utah Beach, in spite of landing in the wrong place, it takes almost no casualties coming ashore. The value of air power done right, and the 9th Air Force displayed it that day. So, we got the naval bombardment. We could talk about that. It's hard to sort out later on, with the French, to sort out who killed what. I have literally got at home the books done by the universities in Normandy, in the Calvados, in La Manche, and in the lower Maritime, Seine-Maritime. They have absolutely done a brilliant job. I can tell you the name of every civilian killed in those cities and towns. I've got them, why they died, how they died, the ones that are unidentified. It's pretty amazing. It's difficult to tell, was it the bombing or the bombardment that took them out. But it's another thing we can talk about later. What I want to talk about is effectiveness, because I think that's a big piece of that. For 70 years, participants and historians have complained about the inaccuracy of the heavy bombers and how they destroyed so few of the German defensive positions. The official texts have acknowledged this ineffectiveness, but strive to mitigate the criticism. Bradley, commanding American forces during the invasion, remarked in his memoirs, not until later did we learn that most of the 13,000 bombs dropped by these heavies had cascaded harmlessly, not so much, they did not cascade harmlessly into the fields, but they didn't hit Germans in the hedgerows 3 miles off the coast. Craven and Cate, the authors of the official history, recognized that commanders on Omaha Beach were disappointed with the air component's inability to neutralize the German defensive positions, but suggest, quote, accurate assessment of the effectiveness of these attacks is impossible, end quote. This evaluation is not entirely correct, and in most instances, it is relatively easy to evaluate the effectiveness of the bombings. How are we doing on time? Are we okay? All right. I can go faster or slower. For example, a little after 0730 Central European time, 35 German soldiers from the 352nd and 716th Infantry Divisions were manning their positions at Widerstand 62. They had been on alert since 0200 hours, thank you, British Air Force, and had taken cover as the heavy bombers and ships tore up the terrain all around them. Other than filling the air with dust and causing their ears to ring, the bombardment had done little damage, and no one was hurt. One of the most powerful German fighting positions on Omaha Beach was intact and ready to fight as several companies from the U.S. 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division approached the beaches in their landing craft. Lieutenant Bernard Freakling, he's the guy on the left there, the supporting artillery forward observer, picked up his telephone and was pleasantly surprised to hear the voice of his battery commander a couple of kilometers away. In spite of the massive bombardment, the line to the artillery unit was intact, and all of the battalion's 105mm guns were untouched and ready to fire. Within moments, the strong points, machine guns, small arms, and light artillery began raking the Americans with direct fire. Mortars within the strong point dropped high explosive shells at the water's edge. The field artillery, thousands of meters behind the strong points, began bombarding landing craft as they reached the coast. The firepower from this relatively small number of defenders was devastating. According to historian John C. McManus, by the end of the day, the U.S. 16th Infantry lost one-third of its manpower, 820 soldiers killed, wounded, or missing in action. The guy up the upper right there, Heinz Severloh, a German machine gunner, is personally killed in many of them. It's an interesting story after the war we can talk about. Labeled Target 43 in the field order, it was the U.S. 2nd Bomb Division's responsibility to attack it. And they sent 36 B-24 Liberators carrying 52 fragmentary high-explosive 100-pound bombs. Because of the timing delay, they missed their target. As Bradley pointed out in his autobiography, this margin for safety undermined the effectiveness of the heavy air mission. To seasick infantry bailing their craft as they wallowed through the surf, this failure in air bombing was to mean many more casualties upon Omaha Beach. The inaccuracy of that morning's air assault allowed German defenders along the invasion beach to do their job unhindered and directly contributed to some of the white headstones in the U.S. military cemetery and the bluffs overlooking this position. If you're not sure where Widerstand Nest 62 is, just go to the Big Red One monument on Omaha Beach. It is probably that the adjustment of bombings had the opposite effect on what planners intended, and it resulted in more Allied and French casualties than it prevented. No wonder few air enthusiasts have wanted to realistically discuss the details of the largest bombing operation in history. And essentially, the largest air bombardment has been ignored by most historians. One more brief example, and then I'll be quiet. So they pass out, they start dropping leaflets, and you see a leaflet there on the right side, warning the people who live in Normandy that their town's going to get bombed. We don't know for sure which town's going to get bombed, but some of them are going to get bombed. Just in case, you ought to leave. Now, back up again, French history. When the Germans invaded in remember, Germany occupied northern France in World War I and Belgium. When the Germans invade in 1940, the old folks who are only 20 years, it's only 20 years since the war, they're going, oh God, let's get out of here. So at one point, there are between 8 and 12 million Frenchmen and Belgians. Let me get that number again. Between 8 and 12 million French men, women, and children, and Belgian men, women, and children on the road running away from the Germans. Remember my example, 10%? Imagine 80 to 120 million Americans running away from the east coast of the United States, for example. That's what's going on. So if you happen to get back home by June 1944 and someone says, leave your house, the answer is going to be no. I'm not going anywhere. Montgomery, that boy right there, he decided one of the things they want to do is take out German towns that are roadblocks. These towns essentially are going to, when I talk about the Germans coming in to take out the landing beaches, these towns are, and again in France, unlike the United States, in France people live in the village. And the farms are outside in the countryside, and then they come back in, and that's where the mills are, the shops are, a very social culture. That's where they'll sit back in the evening and talk about things. So it's also where the bridges are. And so Montgomery's plan is destroy the center of about 20 towns, and the numbers, that's one example of the directive. That list changes on a regular basis. They're always adding. For example, Bayeux was on the original list, and it was taken off, for example. So the idea is to take those towns out and pulverize the center of the town. Rubble the center of the town. I want you to, those of you who want to go back and do a little reading on war crimes, it is against the Hague and Geneva Conventions in all versions and forms and editions to destroy a town ahead that's unoccupied. Most of these are unoccupied, by the way, an unoccupied town just in case. So those are about pretty much. Notice, with the exception of Caen, which has a couple of key bridges, it's right there. By the way, there's no real evaluation in any of this. So a lot of these targets really are right on top of ancient artifacts, buildings, basilicas, churches. I mean, monasteries. It's pretty horrific, frankly. But that's behind the beach. Hence the title of the book, Beyond the Beach. Clever, no? All right. let's just talk about one example, and then we'll close this thing out. In the spring of 1944, 13-year-old Michel Chaperon lived in a boarding house in the Rue Verrier, just east of the center of Saint-Lô. As the administrative center of the Department of the Manche, the city had the secondary schools smaller towns did not. Michel was from one of these, Carentan, which becomes famous later on and other things, 35 kilometers closer to the coast. Her landlady, 34-year-old Simone Gravy, was struggling to get by under the German occupation by renting out the extra rooms in her home to transient students and teachers. Like millions of other women in France, Simone's life was difficult. She had her 4 young children, Jean, 8, Georgette, 6, Yves, 3, and Genevieve, 2. They had to go on with their daily lives where their husband was away. In this case, the Germans had incarcerated the monsieur at the local prison for trying to evade working for the German occupation regime. Other tenants in the small home that spring included 60-year-old Augustine Barbier, a professor at the local law school, her 30-year-old daughter, Yvonne, and new to the boarding house was a recently hired instructor who had just taken a room, and Michelle had yet to have a chance to meet and introduce herself and find out anything about him. After a weekend visiting home, she returned to the boarding house on June 5th in preparation for classes the next day. Awakened that night by the sounds of the invasion coming from the coast, she was, like everyone else, excited and unable to get back to sleep. When she ran to school the next morning, the headmaster told her, school's closed, it's a landing, go home. Her grandmother lived in another part of the city. So after returning to the boarding house to gather some belongings, she raced down to Rue Faulardel. It's great having a native French speaker in the room because my pronunciation's terrible. I'm going to get a critique right after this. Across town to join her. It took her some time to cover the 8 kilometers and climb the hill to her grandmother's house, arriving around noon. Her Aunt Helene was also visiting, so 3 generations of French women spent the day attempting to understand what was going on around them and what was happening along the coast. Then, a little before 8 o'clock in the evening, many bombers arrived over Saint-Lô, and the woman watched with horror as the ancient city burst into flames. Michelle later found out that the bombing had killed her fellow boarders, the Gravy family, and 350 other civilians of the town. She never forgot that terrible night. Keep in mind, that's just this one town, right? Let me get this up here a minute. And the numbers are always changing. Totally that day, with the other tykes that take place, 6th and 7th, 800 civilians killed in the center of the town. By comparison, the 1st Infantry Division on Omaha Beach, where the heaviest fighting was suffered on June 6th, suffered 165 killed. And 713 wounded and 271 missing, which are probably dead. But the point is, whether we quibble about this 10 here or 20 here, these French cities, remember there were a dozen of these, or more, but almost 20 of these, took a heck of a fight. Heavy thing. The ancient castle and the church in the center was destroyed, as much as else. Here's the city. So these are the 2 guys. If you remember to look at the cover of the book, this is Max and Robin. 11 and 13, I think. We get the names here. 13 and 9. The guy in the red sweaters and the gray sweater is 13, the younger guy's 9. And this is taken in July by an American Signal Corps sergeant who's putting up a very famous picture, by the way, in France, putting up a signal tower in Saint-Lô. I spent my entire life thinking that Saint-Lô was destroyed during the fighting before Operation Cobra. I spent my entire life thinking, until a few years ago, that Saint-Lô was destroyed in the fighting. The Saint-Lô was destroyed on June 6th. In the early morning hours of June 7th. The British only fly at night, early morning hours of June 7th. Max and Robin are out there looking for their father. And it sort of typifies the complexity of the French situation. Because here's their city destroyed, the brothers are out looking for their father, and the father has just been executed for being a member of the resistance by the Germans. So bombing France, so what? We talk a lot in the modern era, certainly as a planner, for the Command General Staff College and SAM's School of Advanced Military Studies. We talk about collateral damage. It's always in the newspapers. Anybody who's been through the last 10, 12 years just watching operations in Afghanistan and Iraq have heard the issue of collateral damage. There is still no Air Force doctrine on how to deal with bombing in friendly occupied states. Most cities in lower Normandy are destroyed. They call it the martyred Normandy. These cities all fight themselves to be who's the most damaged city. By the way, if you go up to the area around Calais, where Boulogne-sur-Mer is, and Dunkirk, and Calais itself, they all call themselves the martyred cities. They're having a fight about who got hurt worst. Allied bombing, about 3,000. And the numbers, by the way, we'll never know the whole numbers because so many people left in that original mass migration to get out of there that never get home. There are so many people who are forced laborers. You want to talk about I got a good friend who runs the Holocaust Museum, the historian for the Holocaust Museum. They're still trying to track the number of slave workers that were still in France and Belgium, and they don't have a number on it. So these are low estimate numbers. The Battle of Normandy, go back to your Wikipedia, the student's #1 source for information, and read it and figure how many soldiers died by August 21, and the numbers are getting comparable. And throughout the war, between 60 and 75,000 French civilians perish at the hands of the Allied air forces. So there's a lot of details we could get into. We talk about every chapter in this book is another book. Frankly, it's another book. It could not have been written without a whole lot of help by French archivists, French historians, and British historians who've done a lot of great work in the last few years. What's the effect? When Jean-Paul Courtier, that little guy in the beginning who lost his leg and dies in 1992, is watching American tourists come rolling through Normandy, how does he feel? Sort of like if the police were going into the building, there's a drug cartel next door to your house, and they're selling drugs and doing sex trafficking and all kinds of bad things, and the SWAT team show up and surround the area, and the best way into that house was through yours. And the process of taking out that cartel, they happen to kill, a couple members of your family. How do you feel about the police department liberating you from your oppressors? Today, that's one of many markers. This one stands at St. Lo. And it very clearly says, the French, very politically correct, don't say killed by the American bombardment or the Allied bombardment, but it definitely says killed by to the memory to the victims of the bombardment on June 6, 1944.
I want to introduce two veterans that flew a lot of missions, many of them in France, many of them into Germany. On your left is someone that we met a couple of weeks ago, John Clark. Recently moved from Michigan to here. I'm going to just give a brief history. He was born in Ann Arbor, went to school in Michigan, graduated from high school in June of '41, then entered the Lawrence Institute of Technology. He designed machinery. August of '42, so the war had started, he volunteered for a flight crew. He was a first alternate to attend West Point. In February of '43, he was called to active duty at Jefferson Barracks for basic. He went to Cedar Falls for his cadet training. July of '43, he was sent to Santa Ana, California, and became a pilot flying Stearmans. Went to did his BT-13 training in Merced, California. Advanced in Stockton, AT-17s. Went to Las Vegas. Got into B-17s. Then went to Lincoln, Nebraska, which we've heard many times, to form a crew, and then flew over to England. In August of '44, he arrived in England and lost his plane, and he can talk about that more. They were just doing ferrying, and but was assigned to the 100th bomb group. And Next to him is Dick Brown on your far right. Dick was born in Minneapolis. Family moved to Fargo. He graduated from high school in Fargo in 1939. Okay, oh, you got it on there. Okay. He worked for Northwest Airlines in Fargo as a ticket agent. Inducted in March of '42. Went to went to work on a ranch in California, family ranch, and then came back August of '42 at Fort Snelling. Did his induction. Went down to Birmingham, did his aviation cadet training, classified as a pilot, did his basic training at Bush Field in Augusta, Georgia, and then to Turner Field in Georgia. He then got into B-26s, and you've always heard the story about the B-26s, a bomber a day in Tampa Bay when they were having difficulty flying the B-26. Then came up to Michigan, formed a crew. The crew was supposed to take the northern route, and a lot of the B-17s, B-24s took that, but because the B-26 didn't have the range, they crossed the Atlantic at the narrow point between Brazil and Africa. So it took him 21 days to get into theater. John flew 32 missions, and Dick flew 66 missions, 60 of them out of England, 6 from an airfield in Bayeux. And when we're over there, we're going to try to find that airfield that you flew out of in Bayeux. So let's go forward. John, what attracted you to go into aviation? What attracted you to be a flyer?
My generation was the first to be air-minded because it was a generation born about from 1915 to 1925, immediately after the First World War. Our heroes as youngsters were not only the American Eddie Rickenbacker types, but we thought that Baron von Richthofen was a great guy too. We were interested in flight because it was a new frontier. Maybe we could explore it, maybe we could conquer it, but at least we wanted to participate in it. Growing up in southeastern Michigan, I would see the first pursuit group out of Selfridge Field at Mount Clements, which was about, I would suppose, 5 minutes or 10 minutes by P-12 fighter to my home. And they would fly low, and they had the most attractive airplanes, yellow wings and blue fuselages. I could see the pilots in the cockpits. They were open cockpits in those days, with their goggles on, and it was just a great thrill. Commercial aviation began in the late 20s, and we would see that occasionally, especially the Ford Trimotors, which would fly not far from our place. And in the summer times, there was always an air show at Selfridge Field, Detroit City Airport, and there were air races, too, at what was used to be called Wayne County Airport, now the Detroit Metropolitan. So those were the new areas, the frontiers, and I think that's probably the reason. I made models of every airplane that existed, I think, between the wars. And then later, shortly before going into the Air Force myself, I would design my own models. We have 6-foot wingspans with little gasoline engines to power them. So it was just sort of part of our blood. And interestingly enough, I married a woman who has 1,000 hours in fighters during the war. She was a member of the WASP. And she would cite her own feelings, living in West Des Moines, Iowa as a child, to see the aircraft flying into the Des Moines airport. and also wanted to participate in that. I met her at Las Vegas when she was flying fighters, making mock attacks on B-17s. I was in transition to 4-engine at that point. I think that was the spirit of our generation on that down.
Dick, what attracted you to go into flying?
Pardon?
What attracted you to go into flying?
I was born in 1922, January 6th. Graduated from high school, 1939. I started working for Northwest Airlines as a ticket agent at that time, and I was working between downtown and at the airport. So I got invited a number of times to talk a lot with the pilots out there, and that's how, when it did come up, I was out at the airport when the war started, talking with pilots, and they talked me into being with a group that was being, they gave us an exam, gave us a physical, and said they're looking for aviation cadets. That's navigators, bombardiers, and pilots. Well, I passed the test for it, and because at that time, this is now March of 1942, that they accepted us into the service. But they put us on leave because they didn't have enough training pilots in the service to take care of all the civilians now that were signing up to be pilots and navigators, whatever. But so I was put on leave in March and didn't get into the service until August of 1942. And at that time, I went down, took the exams, and they decided to make me a pilot. And that's when I started my work. I went down to Florida and Alabama in that area because they were civilian training pilots down there that had their own airplanes and all, and the service had to use them because they didn't have enough in the Army or Navy at that time to train us. So I graduated in June of '43 with my certificate saying I was going to be a pilot. And I did that, and they asked me to come around or stay with them in Birmingham, Alabama, and as an instructor. And I said, okay. But about that time, somebody came along with a wife, and they said, oh, you could have that job. Dick will go to the war. So I ended up, I ended up with a certificate to go to B-24s, and I traded it one night in a pub down south. I traded it for the 26 because I didn't want a 4-engine pilot, be a pilot in a 4-engine. I wanted just a twin. I unfortunately lost a brother in the B-24 a couple of years from then. So I ended up trading a gentleman. He wanted to go in 24s, and I went in 26s. And in 1943, I was designated a first pilot in the B-26. And that's when we joined the group. And it's interesting to hear about the 8th Air Force. I was in the 9th because when we arrived over in England in February of 44, they had so many medium bombers in, and they decided that they would make a Ninth Air Force at that time, and that's what they did. So, but you don't see anything out here about the Ninth Air Force. But I was there from February of 44 until September, and it was all Ninth Air Force. So all the bombing on D-days and things.
Great. Pass the mic back over to John. John, how did you feel being a B-17 pilot?
Well, I think one of my basic thoughts was to look forward to the day when I wouldn't be a B-17 pilot.
That's typical of anybody in the military. Wait till you get out.
But at the same time, I had been in engineering prior to going to the war, and so I thought it was a remarkable piece of machinery, and that we were capable of flying to great altitudes, carrying heavy weights. We would sometimes get as high as 40,000 feet. The engines were supercharged, which allowed for that. When one of the major factors that influenced flying during the winter months was weather, and I was always amazed and struck with very impressed with the fact that we could take off in absolute darkness of an English morning, sleet, snow, one airplane every 30 seconds, and we take off into the darkness, and knowing that there were 500 aircraft within 10 miles of us, and we could get into the air, go through a fairly simple procedure, but an effective one for separation, and then assemble over England without, I should say, very many collisions. There were some, but most of the time we could accomplish that assembly. Then on return, later in the afternoon, about 8 hours later, our missions were never less than 8 hours, sometimes a little more. We'd return to England when the weather conditions were below commercial aircraft minimums. The pilots were between 21 and 22 years old, mainly, but we could bring that aircraft in with wounded aboard and damaged, perhaps engines out, when the ceilings were about 100 feet and visibility was less than the length of the runway. This was achieved by what was at the time a very modern development called the Instrument Landing System, augmented, however, with excellent runway entrance lights. We had electronic flashers. Later on, when I was at MIT, I became well acquainted with Harold Edgerton, who originated the electronic flash, and it penetrates fog. At the same time, our runways in East Anglia for the 100th were about 200 feet wide and 6,000 feet long, with overruns of about 500 to 1,000 feet. But the edges of the runways, every 200 feet, had large yellow sodium lights. And to be able to bring the aircraft across the North Sea, focus in, pick up the ILS, and bring it down through just white fog, and suddenly see that wonderful picture of the runway with the yellow sodium lights and the flashers, all on instruments, was what I thought was a great thrill, and that's one of the things that impressed me the most.
A little bit out of sequence here. When was the last time you flew a B-17?
Well, I have the exact date. I think it was March 11th, 1944.
No, I'm talking
40.
about the Yankee Girl.
Oh, Yankee, oh yes. Well, you probably, if you notice the back of my jacket, I'm a senior life member at the Yankee Air Museum. Yankee Air Museum's in Ypsilanti, Michigan, where incidentally the B-24s were made during the war, or half of them. And I was always fascinated with the aircraft. I knew Major General Bodycomb, who flew the aircraft from Arizona to Willow Run, and supported the development of that aircraft, helping to put in instrumentation, providing funds for it, really. We established a scholarship, my late wife and myself, and we supported the institution very much. So the flight crews, I got to know them, mostly Delta captains, a couple of colonels retired, and they'd invite me along to fly. And I think the last time I flew, I've been here in the Twin Cities almost 3 years, was a mission along the Detroit River to scatter the remains, the ashes of a member of the museum. And the flight crew asked me to take over the aircraft after we took off from Willow Run and fly along the Detroit River at 2,000 feet while they dumped the ashes from the aircraft. How many of you have dumped ashes from an aircraft? I think my son, who's sitting here, who has about 1,000 hours in aircraft, has tried it. I asked the flight engineer, I said, Norm, are you going to just open a window and throw it out? He said, oh, no, because once you crack a B-17 window, you get air currents inside. So they would open the rear door and let the little lower pressure outside and just scatter the remains that way.
When was that, John?
Pardon?
When was that?
Oh, let's see. That would have been probably 2005, something like that.
So, did it feel good to handle the B-17 after 60 plus years?
Well, I'll tell you one thing I found interesting. When I took the left seat, it was in the 90s, I think, or maybe 2002. One of the pilots, I think, had changed the trim on the aircraft. Yeah, maybe you don't know quite what that means, but it's possible to adjust small airfoils on the aircraft, all the aircraft control surfaces, so that you can almost fly hands off. That's a well-trimmed aircraft. Formation flying, we attempt to get that. And of course, the trim changes as you use up the fuel, but it means that the forces on the wheel are almost zero, and if it's well trimmed. I would fly formation often with the aircraft as trimmed as possible, and then on the B-17, you have the outboard engine throttles independent, of course, from the inboard engines. You can operate them separately, and it's possible to hold formation when a few feet of the aircraft you're flying off of, very simply by just adjusting power, and of course, aileron controls as necessary. Well, anyway, when we first got in that plane at Willow Run, I noticed when he turned it over to me that the control wheel suddenly came back, and without even thinking, I just reached down and adjusted the elevator trim because it was out of trim. I noticed he had the co-pilot at the time had kind of a smirk on his face because I think he set it off trim to see what would happen. And he didn't even have to think, because after I have 600 hours in the plane, you don't have to really think. You just sort of react. And I didn't even look for the wheels to trim. It was just right there. And I was interested.
Pass it down to Sean. Now, the Yankee girl is coming in. The Yankee girl that he's talking about will be at the air show in July. Is that a commercial or not? Come out and see us.
Well, getting back to DDay, we, as just a regular Army people, didn't know we felt the D-Day would come, but we didn't know when it was until the night before. They told us that we would be getting up early and doing our thing. And so about 2 o'clock in the morning, they woke us up, gave us breakfast, sent us out to the crew room, and told us about D-Day and that we would be bombing Utah Beach. And they gave us our navigators the ideas, and so we went up. It was raining terribly that night. We went out at about 4:45 we took off. Now you got to keep in mind that a B-26 didn't have much mileage. We'd usually go out 2.5, 3 hours, and we had to head home because we'd run out of fuel. Well, at 4:45 they had us take off, and it was in the rain, but we formed our formation, climbed up through the clouds. Of course, it's getting daylight about now, so we can see each other. We went up to 11,000 feet. We were on top of the clouds. So we headed over to the channel, and we found a hole in the clouds over the channel. And our chief of the we flew them six airplanes, one right after, 3 atop and 3 below them. And so we dove down through that area over the channel. We went in and bombed Utah Beach at 1,500 feet. Now, when I went out to my airplane that night, or the next morning there on June 6th, I said, "What are all the stripes?" They had painted black and white stripes all over the airplane. And as you may notice on some of the pictures that you see of different airplanes, they painted 10,000 airplanes that night. And what they told the gunners on the ships down below in the channel, that if they don't have stripes, shoot them. Because like in our case, we had to go down to 1,500 feet, and we'd be traveling 250 miles an hour, going across the channel over all the ships down there. We were headed for Utah Beach, and fortunately, they could see the stripes, but they wouldn't be able to really know what the airplane was. So it was a good thing that they did that. They used I think it was about 3 million gallons of paint on all the airplanes that night, the black and white stripes, and that saved a lot of lives because they could tell. They didn't know what we were, but we had stripes. And a German fighter went through the bunch down there. We saw him, and one of our Mustangs knocked him down. But that's what we had to do.
How many sorties did you make that day? How many sorties did you make on June 6th?
Well, that was my 33rd mission, and I flew 66 altogether, and most of them were out of England. We did move over to Normandy well after D-Day, and into the summer there, we moved over to Bayou, and I flew my last mission out of there. But I put in 66 missions, and I came home. And because I had been a Northwest Airlines person, I went over and talked to them, and they hired me as a pilot. And I flew 36 years with Northwest Airlines, and 12 different and with them, I flew 12 different airplanes, 24,000 hours that I put in the air in airplanes. I couldn't make any money unless I lifted my feet off the ground.
John, I know that you had a couple of missions. Now, the B-17s, they did not. Now, you weren't there on D-Day. You came after, right?
No, I got there in September.
September. Now, did they paint the high altitude planes, the B-17s, B-24s? Did they? I don't think so. I don't. Mark is the Mark Copeland. Stand up, Mark. Mark is now the historian for the 8th Air Force, and replacing, help me, Roger Freeman, who was the English historian, and Mark lives in Apple Valley now, Lakeville. So we were able to bring him in for these. But John, one of your interesting missions, although it wasn't a D-Day mission, was during the Battle of the Bulge. Tell us about that exciting mission.
This was one of the most significant missions, I think, that the 8th Air Force mounted. In the first week in December, first 10 days about, maybe 2 weeks, weather struck England such that essentially all of the American air units were grounded. We sat in our officers' club, which was our sort of social center. We slept in Quonset huts for 10 days, expecting a mission, but none came. The officers' club had a series of lights, like a traffic light put on its side. Red, green, and yellow. Green meant you're standing down. There's no mission for the next day. Yellow meant it is possible. Just stand by, be prepared. Mainly that means you guys ought to get some sleep, probably. Red meant there's a mission scheduled. Well, we sat in the officer club for 10 days watching that light, and it was said it would be green and green, day after day. In the meantime, enormously powerful German army attacked eastern Belgium, beginning what, as the Allies called, the Battle of the Bulge. It's called the Bulge because the German armies penetrated like a bulge across the American and British lines, primarily American lines. But in England, we were down. We were constantly in fog, low level. The weather will fly at 200-foot ceilings. That's sort of a bright, sunny day, the 8th Air Force. But it was so bad you could hardly taxi the airplane. And of course, we were itching because the German armies were making advances that everyone was surprised at. Finally, late in the evening on December 23rd, we were in the officers' club and doing the things that young 20, 22-year-olds will do, eating big slices of English bread slapped high with peanut butter and marmalade, drinking coffee, and a few other things. The first thing we noticed was the light changed from green to yellow, and which meant they closed the bar. And then when it went to red, that meant a mission was scheduled. It was 1 a.m. because we hadn't expected this to happen. And something rather unusual did happen. They say that General Patton asked his church member in his organization, the chaplain, to say a prayer for good weather. Well, General Patton is a great guy, but I'm not sure he's quite that connection with the eternal. But what did happen is that within a matter of hours. Meteorologists hadn't predicted this either. The weather over England went from 0 to clear skies with stars in a matter of a few hours. And so immediately the 8th Air Force had already planned what to do when operation began again, put into effect a maximum effort mission. A maximum effort means every aircraft that can fly will fly. At the 100th Bomb Group, everything on the base flew except the colonel's E-model Fortress that didn't even have any guns on it. We mounted 5 squadrons on the morning of December 24, Christmas Eve. We normally would mount 3. Our squadron happened to tie on with one of another group, the 390th Bomb Group, and 2,000 4-engine bombers took off from England that morning to bomb targets in western Germany, targets that were supplying the Bulge with manpower, weapons, machinery, communications. I think there were 36 separate missions. Now, in itself, that is not terribly unusual, except it's the largest mission the 8th Air Force ever mounted. But what did make it rather unusual for us was that when we flew over the Bulge area, we weren't expecting anything but what we call a simple mission, milk run. But what we didn't know is that there are 900 Tiger tanks in eastern Belgium. They can mount their rifles, that's their gun, 88 millimeter, the same as anti-aircraft fire, up straight, up vertically. They had that capability. And rather than sighting on us with radar, they had their optical sights. At that time, the optical sighting was much more reliable. The first thing that I was aware of was explosions of anti-aircraft fire right in our squadron. That's unusual. Usually there are marker rounds that are fired and they explode to one side or ahead until on the ground they correct their range and aim. But it was right in the squadron, in the left wing of an aircraft right above us, just blew off, and fire started and it went off like that. Aircraft immediately in front of us, because everyone was struggling to put on their helmets and their flak suits, and the aircraft were doing this, and they collided. 2 more collided, then another one blew up, and I remember looking up and seeing a propeller come. It was blown off the plane above us, and I thought, oh, it's going to hit our wing, but somehow it just went right under our right wing, and we didn't get it. We lost 6 B-17s in 30 seconds. That made it a rather unusual mission in that regard. There's one other thing, too, that happened that day. The commanding general of the whole task force, General Castle, volunteered to lead the mission, and over Brussels, 2 Messerschmitt 109s attacked his aircraft, and he was shot down and killed. One of the rare times that a general officer was killed in actual operation. I think it may be the only time, but there was one other general killed flying as an observer earlier in the war. So that was a great loss from General Castle, because he was an outstanding officer, and we lost him that day. Then we continued on to our target, and you'll like this story. The Bombardier, our target was an airfield, Babenhausen, actually called, where the Luftwaffe would, of course, fly off of, and our target was to drop bombs on the runway. in order to prevent them from flying. But after all of that hectic battle of the Bulge area, the bombardier leading our group, he was the 390th Bombardier, had what they called extended vision in his bomb sight, and he forgot to take it out, and we dropped our bombs 14 miles short. Probably killed some Germans. We probably plowed up the area. When we returned to the base, we returned early. Oh, incidentally, I've written my memoirs, and this is all described in the memoirs. Published it about 20 years ago. It was at dark afternoon. We probably got in about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, December 24, Christmas Eve, in England. You can see it was getting dark. The horizon suddenly turned a red. The sky was a deep blue above. And as the returning bombers came in formation, they looked with their wingtip lights on, with their red and green light wingtips, tail lights on, and they had their landing lights on. That was a safety issue. But as they floated through the sky, it looked just like Christmas trees approaching. And it was quite a thrill just to see that. The thrill was modified a little bit later by a crash on our runway, and those things do happen. Well, that's the Christmas Eve
Well,
mission.
I also want you to tell the story before I give it back to Dick. Okay, all right. Lost control here.
One thing, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Dick.
One thing that I didn't mention, the B-26, the 66 missions I flew, only one of them was over Germany. We flew all of our missions over northern France, into Paris. That was one of the problems. We bombed those bridges up and down the different rivers, and if the Germans put a bunch of airplanes on an airport, we'd go bomb that. And what worried us is that we killed a lot of French people. It got to the point that I know, and as they say in that program, there were a lot of the French people killed, and I'm sure our outfit did a lot of it because that's all we bombed was bridges, and of course there's always homes around them. The bridges are in the middle of a town, but we're trying to keep the Germans from getting down to Normandy because they were planning ahead where there might be an invasion. So it was not easy, and I only flew one. My last trip went to Germany, and that was the only one of the 66. Other than that, I was bombing France, Normandy, Holland, all those places. So it was no fun that way, and we didn't like it, but we had to do it. That's what they'd give us the order, and away we'd go and throw the bombs out. And you mentioned something about a wasp. Well, when I got back out of England, I went down to Harlingen, Texas. Now down there were 7 wasp ladies that were flying. They'd go to a factory and pick up an airplane and fly it around the country. And so once in a while we'd get to fly with them. We were towing targets out of the Gulf for the B-24s to shoot at. And it was just great to see those ladies. They could go to 12 different factories and pick up airplanes. That's how good they were. And I could fly one airplane at that time. I ended up flying a lot more, but it was just amazing to see those ladies, how good they were. I used to fly co-pilot or captain with them, and they were really great pilots. And I got to know some. Year after year, I'd go to reunions of all the different things and to see those wasps. Now, it was great.
John, I want you to tell the story. We're going to go to a little Q&A here momentarily, but you had a mission over Frankfurt where you had some fuel problems. Can you tell that story?
Yes, the stories you hear of flight operations over Germany often involve flak fighters and airplanes blowing up. But there are two other issues too that were, so far as the flight crews are concerned, were at least in the last 2 years of the war, were almost as equally important. Weather was you might say, an enemy, although we were equipped at our base to handle it quite well. And the other was fuel. Fuel was always a concern. On the mission that you just referred to, it was Frankfurt on January the 5th, 1945. Our squadron engineering officer came up to me and said, "Hey, John, I got a new airplane for you today." He probably thought he was doing me a great favor. Pilots don't like new airplanes. I used to kid my WASP wife, and she never liked this. I said, you know, getting a new airplane is like getting remarried. You like an airplane that you've flown because they all look alike, they're all called alike, they have the same blueprints, but they don't fly the same. I've never been able to think why, but I expect there's just slight changes in the airfoil and so on. But most important is that the engines all have slightly different fuel consumptions. That's what you really want to know, because you can handle by trim any variation in aerodynamics. So an old airplane is, pardon the expression, like an old wife or an old husband, because you can communicate by A new airplane, you've really got to pay attention to it. And that isn't all. Airplanes have fuel gauges. And the engineering officer said, and we've got a new airplane with a new fuel gauge. Well, we didn't know what the fuel consumption rate was of the engines, and we never liked new gauges. I'm a mechanical engineer, and to this day, I don't believe any gauge. Gauges are not reliable. So anyway, the mission was at Frankfurt. And as we turned off the target at Frankfurt, the 8th Air Force procedures is to drop your bombs, and then you make quite a steep turn, even in formations, and lose about 1,000 feet. So we had gone through that and gaining what we used to call the rally point, although no one ever checked on that. It was just, sort of got back together again, because once you're off the target, out of the flak area, you're liable for injuring enemy fighter, so you try to get close together again. We'd been off past the rally point about 20 minutes or so, and I noticed one of the fuel gauges, it had some warning lights on it for low fuel. One of the red warning lights was just starting to kind of flutter. To us, that meant pay attention. And then there's number 3 engine that's on the right side of the inboard. Then the light went red. At the same time, the fuel pressure for that engine went right to 0. And you could look out and you see the propeller turning, but there's no power. Well, we throw on the fuel booster pump, advance the throttle back and forth, nothing happens. The engine was out of gas. The gauge said 70 gallons. It was a new gauge. Can you see why I get a little skeptical about gauges? So here we were, I suppose we were around 25,000 feet, heading back towards England, and one of the engines, whose fuel tank says 70 gallons, is out of gas. So what do? What's the solution? When are the other engines going to go out? You don't know. So you do all the things you need to do, namely you transfer fuel from that fuel tank to the outboard engine on that side, not expecting anything is going to get there, but at least you're going to make that effort, and then begin to think, what are we going to do? What are our options? Most of the time, experienced pilots, those options all appear in their mind about the same time. There are not too many. You can parachute out if it gets bad. But we're over Germany. If you parachute out, you're going to be a prisoner of the war. And American flight crews, by the way, are not very stiff on regulations. We just talk back and forth like buddies, you know. All right, you guys, here's the situation. What do you want to do? You can parachute now. It's okay. I'll approve that, and I understand completely. Just let me know what you want. Not a single voice. I said, all right, we're going to continue on. And we're going to start lowering our altitude, which is one way of maintaining flight speed, and pull the power off back on all engines. I called the lead ship and I said, we're having fuel difficulties. Request permission to leave the formation. Brussels had an emergency stop. We'd stopped there once in November previously. You could fuel up in Brussels. The lead pilot, or the command pilot, said yes, permission granted. And that's the last they'd heard of us. The official 8th Air Force report went in. One crew crashed northern France, all killed. That's us. So if you get involved with 8th Air Force statistics on those killed, there's something like 26,000. Subtract 10. So we then began to, we had a substitute navigator that mission. That's not always very satisfactory, but I called him Mo. Said, Mo, give us a heading to Brussels as B8, emergency landing at Brussels. And he said, well, I'm not exactly sure where we are. And I said, well, make your guess. I wasn't going to depend on him, but to make your guess. And weather wasn't too big a problem. And so we gradually let down. And as we approached, I think, the French border, guess what? Number 2 fuel gauge light began to blink. Well, by this time we knew exactly what was going to happen. So the fuel pressure went to 0, engine went dead. That engine was feathered, and now we were getting closer to the final decision. So I discussed it with the crew, and I said, we'll come down to safe parachute altitude, which would be about 2,000 feet, a little bit more maybe, and then if any of you want to parachute out now, it's okay, but we're not sure where we are. By that I mean, we're maybe in German territory, we may be in Allied held territory. The front is not a line, it is a line on a map, but in practice it's 5 miles wide. So if you landed 2 miles too soon, you're a prisoner of war. If you land 2 miles on the other side, you may be a hunk of bleeding flesh and wreckage. Who knows? I said, we want you to make your final decision now, because in our judgment, that's both the pilot and myself, in our judgment, we think we can get it down on flat ground, but you should decide what you want to do. The chances of being a prisoner of war is less than it was, but it's still there. They all agreed to stay with the ship. So we had 2 engines feathered and the outboards running for how long? Can anyone tell us? No, we didn't know. So we made the decision then, no parachutes out. In the meantime, we'd thrown everything overboard. If any of you were living in that area, perhaps some flak chutes and guns fell out of the sky. You're welcome. We wanted to get the weight down, and we got down to about 2,000 feet, and then we committed. We're going to put this down on the first flat spot we see. A B-17 is an excellent aircraft for belly landing. I had a model here a little while ago, wish I had it here now. You look at a B-17 from below, the wing, the fuselage, and the other wing all look like the bottom of a big sled. A B-24, on the other hand, has a high wing. And looking up from below, when it comes down to land on flat ground, the fuselage touches first, and the wingtips are, you try to keep them off the ground as best you can, but ultimately, around stall speed, 90 miles an hour, one wingtip will touch on a B-24. And when it touches, it cartwheels. And when it cartwheels, everything is broken apart, gasoline is spewed all over, and boom, there's a big fire. B-17 is not that way. It slides across the ground, so we felt pretty sure if we could get something flat, we'd be better, the best of our opportunities. So we looked ahead, and here was this in the afternoon sun, or afternoon darkness, on the ground with this glare. It was straight as an arrow, and it looked reasonably wide. I thought it was probably a canal or something, but it looked flat. So we then decided, all right, we're going to land on that. So we made one circle around it to check it out, and we realized it wasn't a canal, it was an airstrip. It turned out to be an advanced Royal Air Force Spitfire squadron, operated incidentally by all Polish guys, tough as nuts too. And they had laid steel plates on the ground, perforated plates, standard procedure for an advanced airfield. And so as we came down, it's 2,500 feet long. We needed 6,000 back in England. And but any landing strip in a storm, okay? And so this turned out to be at the city of Ghent, Belgium. And as we brought on the final approach, we tried to put down the flaps to slow us up, give us a little bit lift at low speeds, greater lift, but they were shot out over the target, apparently. Aircraft that don't look as though they've been hit by flak often are, because flak comes in all sizes. And apparently this time, our flaps were shot out, so we couldn't get the flaps down. The landing gear did come down, which we're grateful for. And as we approached that strip, suddenly out of the mist of the afternoon sun, a building about 4 stories high appeared right in front of us. So we just lifted the right wing to clear it, landed, and the outboards quit. And we didn't feather them because you didn't have time. And so we glided the last 1,000 yards as a 30-ton glider, and then touched down on the strip. But if this had been in normal operations, we would be going much slower. We were probably going about 110, 115 miles an hour when we touched down. The strip was steel plates. It was January. Snow and ice had fallen and melted, and it was just like a big slide. I can remember looking down at the wheels. They were locked to the brakes on, and we just skidded along like it was a sled. And then the end of the runway suddenly came up. Bushes, trees, mud, water splashed up all over, and we just kept right on going. through the swamp, which it was. And at the very end, up on the nose, the wheels must have hit something solid. Up on the nose was all crunched, and then it fell back. At that point, our training really paid off because you practice crash landings in training. The crew, except for cockpit crew, the pilot, co-pilot, and the flight engineer, everyone gets into the radio room and sort of nudges up against each other. Any soft stuff you have, like parachutes and so on, you stack around. So you're kind of packed in. And that's exactly what they did. And so the aircraft turned out to be totaled after the crash, but there wasn't a scratch on anybody. And in the cockpit, the procedure is... Pardon? Yeah, is a procedure for the flight engineer to turn his guns forward. Because in a B-17, you get out in the cockpit going throughout the side window. I don't know how we ever got out. That window is not large enough, but we got out, and you can reach up and grab the gun barrel and pull yourself up on top of the fuselage, because the cockpit is about 10 feet ahead of the leading edge of the wing. And if you get out the window and can't get up on top of the fuselage, you just have to drop and hit whatever's below. So I was pleased to see all of these emergency procedures being done precisely, instantly, and automatically, without requiring any instructions. I slid my window back, looked up, and there was that gun barrel. The gun had been taken out of it and tossed out, but you could pull yourself up, and we just got up on top of the aircraft, walked down, jumped on the wing, and went off. By this time, there was so much mud, we just stepped out onto the mud. So we were all there and safe. We looked around just in time to see another Fortress coming in, doing exactly what we did, and it came right at us. I could still see its propellers. They were out of gas too, and their wing went right up over our wing, and afterwards we saw them, and they said, well, we saw you guys, so we thought we would try it too.
Pass it down. Dick, did you have something else?
D-Day.
Did you?
D-Day, not. It's D-Day we're supposed to be talking about.
Say, Dick, did you have any crashes?
No, that's okay. I'm about to leave.
Okay.
At 97, I don't want to sit around all day.
Did you have any crashes?
Pardon?
Did you have any crash landings?
This is fine, what we've done.
You want to go? Well, listen, we will excuse you, but thank you, Dick.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Support for this program provided by viewers like you. Thank you. Additional support provided through the Catherine B. Anderson Fund of the St. Paul Foundation. Upcoming roundtable topics can be found at www.mn-ww2roundtable.org. Production services provided by Barrows Productions.